Ramree Island lies off the coast of Myanmar, low and green, cut through with mangrove swamps that flood and drain with the tide. In daylight, the island looks almost benign: flat water, dense roots, long channels of mud and brackish pools. But in early 1945, during the closing months of the Second World War, those mangroves became the setting for a story that still lurks below the surface. A retreat through the swamp, a night of cold, opportunistic death, and a legend later described as the deadliest animal attack in history. Whether that description is accurate is still debated, but what matters is why the story still persists. By the final year of the Second World War, control of the Burmese coastline had become strategically vital. Ramree Island offered airfields, supply routes, and a foothold in the Bay of Bengal. Japanese forces had occupied the island earlier in the campaign, but by 1945, Allied advances across Burma had begun to isolate those positions. As British and Indian units moved in, supply lines were cut, evacuation routes narrowed, and retreat became inevitable. It was under these conditions that Japanese troops found themselves pushed inland, away from the coast, away from cover, and toward the mangrove swamps that cut through the heart of the island. By early 1945, the Japanese position on Ramree Island had become untenable. Allied forces were tightening their grip, cutting off supply lines and narrowing escape routes. Retreat was no longer a tactical choice, it was a necessity. The inland route was blocked. The coast was exposed. That left the mangroves. They stretched for miles along the island's interior. The swamp offered concealment, but at a cost. Thick mud, tangled roots, brackish water, and narrow channels that flooded and drained with the tide. Progress was slow, orientation was difficult, and once night fell, visibility collapsed almost entirely. Accounts suggest that the retreat began after dark. Men moved quietly, wading chest deep in places, carrying weapons above the waterline, unsure of what lay ahead or beneath them. Even without what we know is coming, the swamp was lethal. Insects, infection, exhaustion, dehydration. The simple act of standing still too long could mean sinking deeper into the mud. War has many ways of killing people. On Ramree Island, the landscape itself was one of them. Saltwater crocodiles were already present on Ramree Island long before the war arrived. The mangrove swamps that cut through the island are ideal habitat. They're warm, tidal, rich in prey, and largely undisturbed. Crocodiles do not move into places like this suddenly. They persist there quietly over generations. During the fighting, there is no evidence that the animals behaved unusually. They were not driven mad by gunfire, nor drawn by some singular event. They were simply just there. They occupied the same channels and pools they always had. What changed was not the crocodiles, but the number of humans entering their territory, wounded, exhausted, moving slowly through water at night. In these conditions, a crocodile does not need to hunt actively. It waits, it responds to vibration, to movement, and to opportunity. This is what is often lost when the story is retold. The animals were not participants in a battle. They were part of an environment that had suddenly become crowded with vulnerable prey. Cold, opportunistic, unconcerned with intent or uniform. Most of what we know about Ramree Island comes not from official reports, but from later accounts. Memoirs, retellings, second and third-hand descriptions written years after the fighting had ended. Contemporary military records are sparse. They confirm a retreat into the mangroves. They confirm heavy losses. What they do not contain is a detailed account of hundreds of men being killed by animals in a single night. The most frequently cited descriptions appear later in post-war writing, often repeated without question, sometimes with details added, numbers adjusted, and language sharpened. In these retellings, the swamp becomes a stage. The crocodiles move from presence to protagonist, and the line between what was witnessed, what was inferred, and what was imagined begins to blur. This is where the story hardens into legend, not because it was invented, but because uncertainty is uncomfortable. Violence seeks explanation, and animals, ancient, silent, and already feared, offer one readily. What is often lost in the telling is context, the exhaustion, injury, darkness, the simple fact of men moving through water at night in hostile terrain. This predation was situational, not monstrous. Whatever happened in those mangroves did not require intent, coordination, or malice, only opportunity and a landscape that offered it repeatedly. I've spent time observing Nile crocodiles along the Zambezi and Zambia. In some stretches of river, their numbers are estimated at roughly one animal every 10 metres. What strikes you isn't aggression, but how easily they vanish. A slight shift in light, a ripple, a submerged shape you realise too late is not a log at all. They merge into the riverbank, into shadow, and into stillness. Now imagine that density, not along a wide river in daylight, but in a confined mangrove swamp at night. Hundreds of exhausted people moving slowly through water, unable to see beneath the surface, inevitably coming into contact with animals they can't detect. And not Nile crocodiles, but saltwater crocodiles, larger, heavier, and fully at home in tidal mangroves. In that context, predation doesn't require pursuit, only contact. The numbers attached to Ramree Island vary wildly. Some accounts speak of dozens killed, others of hundreds. A few later retellings go further still, presenting the event as the single deadliest animal attack in recorded history. What's striking is not just the scale of those claims, but how little they are anchored to primary evidence. There are no contemporary body counts. We have no detailed after-action reports describing mass predation. No clear accounting of who witnessed what and when. But as always, this does not mean nothing happened. It means that what happened was absorbed into the fog of war, where deaths from exposure, drowning, disease, and combat blur together, and where survivors carry fragments rather than full records. In those conditions, numbers become symbolic. They expand to express shock, fear, and disbelief, not necessarily precision. And yet the story persists. It persists because it sits at the intersection of things we already fear: darkness, water, loss of control, and animals that predate us by millions of years. The label deadliest animal attack in history endures not because it is proven, but because it is memorable. It gives shape to an event that otherwise resists neat explanation. Ramree Island doesn't give us certainty. It gives us a reminder of how stories from not just what happened, but what people needed to understand afterward. Ramree Island does not offer a clean ending. The mangroves are still there. The tides still rise and fall through the roots. Crocodiles still move through those channels, doing what they have always done, indifferent to the stories attached to them. What remains is not certainty, but tension, between history and memory, between animals as they are and animals as we imagine them to be. Something terrible happened on Ramree Island in 1945. People died, many of them far from help, in conditions that stripped away control and clarity. Beyond that, the details blur, not because they are unimportant, but because war rarely leaves behind clean edges. The story endures because it speaks to a deeper fear, not just of crocodiles, but of what happens when human systems collapse and we are forced back into environments that do not recognise us as special. In the end, Ramree Island isn't a warning about monstrous animals. It's a reminder that nature does not pause for human conflict, and that when we move through it exhausted, injured, and unseen, the outcomes can be unforgiving. The mangroves don't remember the war. We do.